HOA showdown, rules, rage, and a street full of neighbors. It was an ordinary Thursday afternoon in the quiet suburban neighborhood of Crestwood Estates, a place where meticulously maintained lawns and white picket fences were more than just a sign of pride. They were a symbol of belonging, conformity, and the unspoken rule that everyone followed. It was a place where things were supposed to be calm, peaceful, and uniform, and where the most exciting event was the occasional block party or bake sale. But on that fateful day, all of that changed. The sun was high in the sky, casting a golden hue over the neatly paved streets, as a group of residents gathered on Elm Street, their faces tense, their voices raised in anger. At the center of it all stood two figures: Carol Daniels, the president of the Homeowners Association, HOA, and Dave Hunter, a longtime resident who had never been one to follow the rules, at least not without a fight. The conflict had been brewing for months. Carol, as the HOA president, took her job seriously. She had made it her mission to ensure that Crestwood Estates remained the picture-perfect neighborhood it had always been. The grass had to be cut a certain length, the flower beds had to be meticulously arranged, and no one could ever paint their house a color that didn't fit within the HOA's strict guidelines. It was a matter of pride, and in Carol's mind, a matter of preserving the value of the homes and the neighborhood's reputation. But Dave, a self-made contractor with a love for unconventional designs, had always pushed back against the HOA's rigid rules. His house stood out like a sore thumb among the perfectly uniform homes. The paint on his house was a shade of bright red that clashed with the muted tones of the other homes. His garden was wild and untamed, filled with wildflowers, native plants, and a few well-placed sculptures that were anything but proper. For years, he had received warnings and fines from Carol's HOA, but Dave had always ignored them. He had even gone as far as hanging a sign on his front door that read, "Freedom over conformity." But this time it was different. The HOA had had enough. Carol had sent Dave yet another warning, this time for an even more outrageous infraction. Dave had started building a fence around his backyard, but not just any fence. This was a fence that was designed to stand out. It wasn't the usual white picket fence that the HOA encouraged. It was a tall, black metal structure with intricate designs that screamed rebellion. Dave had put it up without permission, and when Carol caught wind of it, she was furious. She knew that something had to be done to put an end to his defiance. That's when the HOA called in the big guns. Carol, along with a handful of HOA board members, arrived at Dave's house early that morning. They were armed with violation notices and legal papers, ready to take action. They knocked on Dave's door, and when he answered, the confrontation began. "What do you think you're doing?" Carol demanded, holding up the notice in her hand. "I'm building a fence," Dave replied casually, wiping his hands on his work shirt. "And I don't need your permission. You're breaking the rules." Carol's voice rose, her face flushed with anger. "This is a violation of the HOA guidelines, and you know it." "Those guidelines are a joke," Dave retorted, crossing his arms over his chest. "You can't force everyone to live the same way. This is my property, and I'll do what I want with it." "You're destroying the integrity of this neighborhood," Carol shouted, her face now turning a shade of red that matched the color of Dave's house. "If we let you get away with this, it will set a precedent. Other residents will think they can do whatever they want, and soon, Crestwood Estates will be no better than a slum." Dave scoffed. "You can't control everything. You can't force everyone to conform to your idea of what's proper. Maybe it's time for the HOA to mind its own business." The argument escalated quickly. Voices were raised. Hands were thrown in the air. Carol threatened to fine Dave, to take him to court, to report him to the city for building the fence without proper permits. Dave responded by telling Carol that he didn't care about her fines or her rules. He was sick of being told what he could and couldn't do with his own property. The neighborhood, once a symbol of peace and tranquility, had suddenly become a battleground. Neighbors began to gather on the street, watching the confrontation unfold. Some stood in silence, others murmured amongst themselves, and a few were openly taking sides. On one side, there were those who agreed with Carol, who believed that the HOA was necessary to maintain the neighborhood's order and value. On the other side, there were those who sympathized with Dave, who felt that the HOA's rules were too restrictive and stifling. But what no one expected was how far this argument would go. As the confrontation dragged on, the tension in the air was palpable. The crowd grew larger, and soon, the entire block was standing on the sidewalk, watching the showdown between Dave and Carol. It was as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath, waiting for something to snap. And then it happened. Carol, red-faced and enraged, grabbed the violation notice in her hand and marched toward Dave's front yard. "If you don't take this fence down, I'll have no choice but to call the police," she threatened. "Go ahead," Dave sneered. "I'd love to see you try." And just like that, the situation spiraled out of control. Carol called the police, and within minutes, a patrol car arrived on Elm Street. Officer Stevens, a young but seasoned officer, stepped out of the car and surveyed the scene. He had dealt with neighborhood disputes before, but this one felt different. There was an undercurrent of something more than just a disagreement over a fence. There was frustration, anger, and a deep divide in the community. The officer walked up to Carol and Dave, who were still standing in the street, exchanging heated words. He raised his hand to get their attention. "All right, what's going on here?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Carol was the first to speak. "This man is breaking the rules of the Homeowners Association," she said, pointing at Dave. "He's put up a fence without permission, and it's against the HOA guidelines. I've already warned him multiple times, but he refuses to comply." Dave crossed his arms. "I'm not breaking any laws. This is my property, and I'm building a fence. I don't need her permission or anyone else's." Officer Stevens nodded, his gaze shifting between the two. He could see the tension in the air, but he also knew that this wasn't a criminal matter. It was a civil dispute. He couldn't get involved in the HOA's rules or decide who was right and who was wrong. His job was to keep the peace. "I can't enforce HOA rules," he said finally. "This is a private matter. If you want to pursue this further, you'll have to go through the courts. But I suggest you both take a step back and calm down before things get worse." Carol, clearly frustrated, stepped back, but she wasn't ready to give up. "I'll take this to the next level," she muttered, before turning to the crowd that had gathered on the street. "This man is ruining everything. If we let him get away with this, we'll all lose control of this neighborhood." But Dave wasn't backing down. "I'm not the problem here," he said to the neighbors, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "The real issue is the HOA and their overbearing rules. Maybe it's time to stand up for what's right." The crowd, which had been silent until now, began to murmur in agreement. Some people nodded, while others looked uncertain. For the first time, it felt like the community was divided. The tension that had been building for months was finally spilling over, and there was no turning back. The standoff continued, with Carol glaring at Dave, and Dave standing tall, defiant. The police officer, seeing that the situation wasn't going to resolve itself anytime soon, turned to leave. "If this continues," Officer Stevens said, "I'll have to write a report, and you'll have to go to court." And with that, he walked back to his patrol car, leaving the two bitter neighbors standing on opposite sides of the street, the weight of the situation heavy in them. As Officer Stevens drove away, silence fell over Elm Street. The neighbors slowly began to disperse, returning to their homes with furrowed brows and whispered conversations behind closed doors. But though the street had gone quiet, the neighborhood itself was anything but calm. Something had shifted. It wasn't just about a fence or a stubborn homeowner anymore. It was about power. It was about the rules. And it was about whether the community of Crestwood Estates still believed in the order it once held so dearly, or if it was ready to revolt against it. Carol Daniels, flustered and humiliated in front of the very people she once ruled over with confidence, returned to her home and immediately scheduled an emergency HOA board meeting. Within 2 hours, the conference room at the Crestwood Community Center was full, not just with the board members, but with a dozen homeowners who had witnessed the confrontation and were now curious about what would happen next. Carol stood at the head of the room, charts, papers, and binders spread out in front of her like a general preparing for war. "This isn't just about Dave Hunter," she began, adjusting her glasses. "This is about protecting the integrity of our neighborhood. We have guidelines for a reason. Order, beauty, consistency. You all moved here for a reason, and I refuse to let one man turn this place into chaos." There were murmurs of agreement, but also a few heads tilted in uncertainty. Martin Fisher, a middle-aged father of 3 and one of the quieter board members, raised his hand. "But Carol," he said carefully, "Dave's not the only one who feels this way. A lot of homeowners think the HOA has gotten too strict. There's no flexibility. You fined the Walters for leaving their trash bins out for an extra hour. You cited Linda for painting her mailbox navy instead of black. Some people are starting to feel like we're being watched all the time." Carol's eyes narrowed. "Rules are rules, Martin. If we start bending them, even a little, where does it end?" "But are the rules for the people, or are the people for the rules?" someone said from the back of the room. All heads turned. It was Maya Rivera, a young single woman who had just moved into Crestwood 6 months ago. She folded her arms. "I moved here because I like the peace," she said. "But the HOA emails, the notices, the passive-aggressive tone, it's overwhelming. We want order, yes, but not at the cost of our peace of mind." The room grew still. Carol could feel control slipping. She gripped the podium harder. "If we let this behavior slide, we're inviting disorder," she insisted. "What Dave has done is disrespectful, not just to the rules, but to all of us. His fence is a symbol of defiance, and we cannot allow rebellion to spread." Meanwhile, Dave wasn't sitting quietly. He had his own plan in motion. That same evening, he held a Freedom in Crestwood backyard gathering, inviting every homeowner who had ever received an unfair fine, warning letter, or passive HOA threat. Surprisingly, over 30 people showed up. Some came out of curiosity. Others came in frustration. And a few came because, like Dave, they had been waiting for anyone, to challenge Carol's grip on the community. Under a string of backyard lights, Dave stood before the crowd with a beer in hand and fire in his voice. "I didn't build that fence just for me," he said. "I built it for every one of you who's been told what your porch should look like, how many flowers you can plant, what color your shutters can be. Enough is enough. It's time to take back our neighborhood." Cheers erupted. People clapped. A few even shouted, "Down with the HOA." What began as a personal feud was becoming something far larger, a movement, one that questioned whether the HOA still served the people or had begun to rule them. Over the next week, Crestwood Estates saw a wave of small, symbolic rebellions. Someone painted their garden gnome neon green and put it in the front yard. Another family put up a wind chime that had been previously banned. A group of teenagers drew chalk murals on their driveways. Some changes were tiny, almost unnoticeable, but the message was loud: "We're done being policed." Carol was horrified. She fired off emails daily, demanding immediate compliance. She threatened escalations. She warned of legal consequences. But every email seemed to be met with more resistance. And for the first time, she realized her authority was no longer absolute. And then came the petition. Dave and Maya worked together to draft a proposal: a recall of Carol Daniels as HOA president and a vote to amend the HOA charter to allow more flexibility and homeowner-led decision-making. In just 3 days, they had over 75 signatures, more than enough to trigger a special vote. Carol received the petition on her doorstep in a bright red envelope. No one needed to write anything on it. She knew exactly what it meant. She was at a crossroads: dig in her heels and fight harder, or step down and admit defeat.